My guest today is David West. Dave will be talking about the future work. Dave is a product owner and the CEO of scrum.org. He's a frequent keynote speaker at major industry conferences and is widely published author of articles and research reports. He's also the co-author of 2 books. Dave has a long history of managing teams and software development. Joining Dave is 2 panelists, Jim Creer, our CIO, and Gene Sorbo, the CEO of Strong Tower Solutions.
I'm really going to talk about the knowledge work and what's happening. In fact, Gartner estimates by 2030 that there'll be 1 billion people doing knowledge work. 1 billion out of the 3.4 billion people that are doing work on this planet will be doing work that is predominantly, not exclusively, predominantly about the use of information. The assets are information based, etc. McKinsey says out of that billion, there's about 300 million that would be described as complex work. Think of software engineers, architects, designers, the creative arts, etc. People at Pixar, for instance. You can't help but notice on every Pixar film how many people are involved in that film, and the credits as you're trying to find your cell phone that you've dropped into the seat at the cinema. You know, and they're with respect to the 300 million, they say that it's growing at about 10%. And also the impact of the pandemic has highlighted some of the traits of the future of knowledge work, right? Not just in terms of remote work, which is obvious, but also in terms of how teams work, the skills they need, the environment that those teams or individuals operate in. So really, what I'd like to talk about is not everything, because it's a huge subject, but 3 things that have popped out for me with respect to that. So I think, you know, we could talk about lots of things. We talk about the impact of the gig economy. We could talk about the impact of working from home. We could talk about, you know, what does it really mean for trust, all those things. But today's very quick session, I'd like to concentrate on 3 things: balancing specialists with generalist skills. What we've seen, particularly because of the pandemic, is that having generalists in your team is incredibly valuable because you're not totally sure what the work is. And obviously you still need specialists, but there is this sort of like, how do you balance that? A willingness as well by people to do things that perhaps they're not specialist in. So there's something around skills, generalists, specialists. There's something around process, particularly around agile process. What we've found, and you know, there's multiple studies that reinforce this, is that the agile organizations were more responsive to the pandemic, and actually many of the non-agile teams started exhibiting many of the agile practices, you know, whether that be a transparent backlog, whether that be a daily meeting, whatever those things are. And that those practices now are being used in broader than just IT. And complex product development. It's being used everywhere. So what does the agile processes look like? And then the last one is something around the organizations. You know, what we're also seeing, and the data seems to be supporting this, but it's still early days, is that organizations that have a clear understanding of their mission customer have navigated to a different way of working much easier than organizations that are very inward looking, very systems looking, very application looking. And adding to that, organizations that have a big focus on people are obviously more successful as well. And we'll talk about that. So the 3 things: specialists, generalists, agile processes are everywhere, and then this organization alignment, particularly around customers and outcomes.
Okay. So, so this balanced generalist, this is a struggle that we've been kind of dealing with. How do you do that? You know, do that if you have a small team and you have a more diverse type of work? How do you manage that? You don't want to have all specialists.
But... Yeah. And how do you deal with the fact that you still need specialists, but you don't totally know what those specialists are? And how do you, it's a real challenge. I mean, I a personal experience, having done a startup where we started, I was employee, 21 or something. and we had one team and we had to just survive, and we begged, borrowed and stole. You knew if you got a phone call from me that you were, you know, if I invited you out for dinner, it was because I needed something from you, because I wasn't totally sure how to do something, whether it be dealing with some sort of legal stuff, setting up a new entity, dealing with some tax things, etc. You become a very good generalist when you do a startup. But we've spent 100 years really focusing on building strong specialist skills. You know, management, you know, particularly after the 1920s, suddenly became a specialist. First MBA was what, in the 50s, in the 50s, right? And ultimately, you know, people became less flexible and more brittle. Now, obviously, this is a huge generalization, and you know, but how many times have you been on a software development team where we all need to do some testing, but the guys that do front end development or back end development or the DBA or whatever really don't want to do that, you know, but everybody, we need to test now. You know, we've definitely built in a level of inflexibility and, dare I say, brittleness with this hyper efficiency focus. You know, you need these experts. We still need experts, we still need specialists, but they need to augment these generalists, they need to provide services to these generalists. You know, we talk a lot about T-shaped, pie-shaped, comb-shaped. You know, what is that layer across the top, right? And what we've found is that it is the ability to sort of, dare I say, care about the business, that sort of flexibility, the desire to focus on the outcome rather than the task. Those things become incredibly important. Skills like facilitation, appreciation of people, that EQ sort of, not the job coach, but the skill coaching is become, you know, asking powerful questions, you know, going in as a scientist rather than a politician when you have conversations. Those things become incredibly important as we build this sort of general sort of set of capabilities. And I also think, though, supporting these, we're seeing two sort of like emerging roles when we start talking about people, which is the everybody calls it an agile coach, but I don't know what it's called. But this sort of, I think of Star Trek, and I was always confused when I watched Next Generation who Counselor Troy was, right? I don't know if you're familiar with TNG, but there was this lady that wasn't like head of weapons, didn't do navigation, wasn't a doctor or a robot, you know, wasn't second in command, that facilitated the human elements of the enterprise. I thought that Gene Roddenberry sort of like was barking mad. And also, did she have an American accent? Did she have an English accent? I wasn't totally sure. But increasingly, I see that he was being inspired by looking at basically having a set of skills brought into the enterprise to help facilitate that. So one, you know, enabling this generalist versus specialist is really this coaching mindset, and maybe the role agile coach.
We are taking a break from our show to talk about gaining wisdom from our success ladder benchmark. Every software project has risk. This is a bet, just as much as buying a lottery ticket or going to casino. However, do you know your odds? Do you know how to improve your odds? Our success ladder benchmark gives you your odds of success by profiling your project against 50,000 cases in our chaos database. It also gives you hints on where you can improve your odds. There are only few inputs and 6 runs in the benchmark. After each run, the benchmark will indicate your chances of success. The Success Ladder benchmark is part of our membership. You can benchmark as many projects as you want and even play what-if games. You can change this or change that, and each run will tell you your chances of success. To get your Success Ladder benchmark, go to standishgroup.com. Now back to our show.
Enabling, you know, making sure we're all moving in the right direction. Product ownership becomes important as well. You know, that definitely product leadership. So I think what we're seeing increasingly is that we're trying to build teams that are not jacks of all, masters of none, but a little bit like that. Very much focused on the outcomes. So being led by some sort of product and product leadership, product owner, supported by this thing called an agile coach. And this is not just true of software teams, but teams in general. And I think that's very, very, very interesting. Um, so as we move into this next phase, I see that being something of the future of sort of work in individuals.
Well, let me see if I'm listening correctly and understanding. Um, so one of the things that you're saying is, first of all, we need to have someone, and you can use the term agile leader or coach or whatever, someone with soft skills. You need someone with soft skills to be able to manage the day-to-day idiosyncrasies of your staff, for one thing. The other thing is you have a bunch of generalists, which I think is a beautiful idea because that's what I did in my past lives. And then when I needed a specific skill, I brought someone in, a contractor with specific skill, worked with the generalist, and then get rid of them. And that way it would augment my team without alienating my team at the same time.
Yeah. And I think that's exactly what I'm saying. Whether we call them soft skills or people skills is interesting. Soft always makes them sound a little bit, as an engineer, I always find that like alien, but I've realized increasingly as I have to work with people that there's times when I could do with some help to deal with, a conflict, a lack of understanding, getting quickly through the sort of the visioning so that people can have a shared understanding, dealing with these things, and whether it's powerful questions or visual facilitation, or these skills are incredibly powerful, and ultimately I think I have to build those skills up, but the best way of doing that is have somebody to help me to do that so maybe in the future that will erode into a standard set of skills that everybody has, but at the moment I think it's very, very important. And the point you made about generalists is exactly, yes, you need to build a team that's focused on the outcomes, that has almost enough skills to deliver a done increment, and then get them to work with others, because ultimately that gets you better stuff, because you get them working with different points of view, different perspectives. They learn a lot more about the problem as they bring in these things, whether it's security, whether it's hyper performance if we're talking technology, in the case of marketing, whether it's data analytics, Google Analytics, whatever those things are, and bring those things in and build that network for them to take advantage of, but also create that sort of like knowledge in the team, and they become more and more flexible and more, it's not as efficient maybe, but it is ultimately, I think, a lot more agile and a lot more capable.
How does so if we have a generalist and some specialists, and we have a process that we've developed that works for the organization, how does the organization adapt to this? Because that seems to be the big problem. They can have a Scrum team here and a Scrum team there, but the organization is either fighting it or doing
That's
other
a Yeah. Well, most organizations were built with the industrial mindset in place, right? That's how they've become. And it's an amazing thing. We've built bridges and tunnels, and we've done amazing things with this project sort of, product, this sort of mindset. So I'm not going to dispel that, but and then they sort of it goes to the sort of nth degree. How many times have you been in meetings where you're debating sending somebody to a conference that's, say, $1,000? You look around the room for an hour, we've spent $2,000 having that conversation, and you think to yourself, hang on, what's happening? And how many times have you seen the lack of decision making and the lack of those things get in the way? I don't know how to change organizations. I've spent what 20, 30 years of my career trying to limit it, whether it was the unified process and some of that stuff, use cases, good architecture, objects. I don't know. What I do know, though, is the organizations that I've seen over the last 18 months when I've zoomed around the world, literally, using a technology called Zoom, I have seen the most effective ones are ones where they align their teams to customers and outcomes. Ultimately, the least successful organizations are the ones where you've got teams that are sort of supporting multiple customers. They're not totally sure who the customers are. There's many different systems. You can't get a good sprint goal. You can't get a good product goal. Your backlog just looks like a lunch of work. They're the least successful organizations. And whether you call them value streams, whether you call them customer streams, whether you call them tribes, if you're at Spotify, it doesn't really matter. But that exposing that value, and building, organizing around the outcomes. But it often goes against, and Jim, you mentioned that, the sort of the generic people, organizations like say, well, hang on, that's a bit messy, isn't it? Because to support that customer, they've got to dip their hands in 20 systems. And you say, yes, it is a bit messy, but ultimately the benefit of them and and if these systems support other customers having to dip their hands in those systems, is you end up with, instead of it all comes to one team who then have to deal with the trade-offs, you end up with very clear those trade-offs being decided up front, because those teams have to communicate, because you're like, is this customer more important than this customer? Is this outcome more important than that? And it enforces decisions in the system. So the most important thing is aligning around customer. And then soon as you start aligning, that means you have to budget in that way. That means you have to put incentives and promotions and those things in that way. The one thing that gets in the way of all of that is you say, yes, you're on that team focused on that customer. By the way, the KPIs that we decided at your review last year are all about other things. Or if you budget on the systems rather than budget on the value streams and the customers, you're going to be distinctly, well, one, it's a lot more complicated, which, if you just could understand the value that stream provides, understand what your investment profile is it early in its life? Is it late in its life? And is it being end of life? Then you can easily work out how much you're going to spend on it, which then you just say, well, that means we've got 10 teams, and then connect them up to the people that use that support that, stakeholders that that enable it, and customers that are buying things from it. And then you'll decide the priority really easy, so it can simplify everything if you have that alignment. And Scrum and Agile just naturally falls out of it. So it's not about transforming organizations to use Agile. It's really transforming organizations to be aligned to customers. And because we know that customers don't know what they want, you're going to have to release frequently. You're going to have to be transparent, inspect and adapt, have sprints and all that. It just sort of naturally falls out, in my opinion.
How are you seeing incentives and motivations change at organizations who are trying to make this shift from that old sort of culture and hierarchy to this new world that we're all living in?
I think that organizations have to uncover those problems. And I think that the organizations that are doing that are realigning around team objectives. They're incentivizing people, their bonuses on the outcomes.
Now for the afterthought. This is a time for reflection on what David had to say. I sit in my easy chair, sip some scotch, close my eyes, pat my dog Oster, and contemplate on what was said. Dave focused on three things: specialist versus generalist. Agile processes are everywhere, and then the organizational alignment, particularly around customers and outcomes. The first item is specialist versus generalist. I totally agree with David, and it is a major tenet of the infinite flow process. We suggest the teams are made up of generalists that match about 80% of the work for the business unit. Then you bring in specialists as needed. The specialists also help the team grow and learn new skills and expand their capability. The second item is the agile processes are everywhere. Well, software is also everywhere. Therefore, we need an agile team everywhere helping individual business units improve their software capabilities. Again, another tenet of infinite flow and the infinite flow network of teams. The third item, and this is one of the major ones, is organizational alignment. Changing the organization aligned with the current strategy and goals is very hard, especially true as organizations go through massive changes brought about by current events like COVID-19. While Scrum can help, and is a major part of the infinite flow, the key is having an active sponsor. This is a sort of a dedicated customer that can change the business unit to the new strategy. And having a network of sponsors in coordination with each other, this really takes away from the top-down approach and actually makes it more democratic. This top-down approach has never really worked well in the past. And I think this is probably the most important feature of infinite flow. I want to thank our guest and our panelists for being part of the show. And thank you for being part of the show. I hope we have given you a few minutes of wisdom. We look forward to seeing you next time on Wisdom Wednesday. This is your host, Jim Johnson.